There is a moment, and if you've ever stood at the edge of a decision that could destroy you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A moment where the life you were born into and the life you were meant to live split into two roads. And you have to choose. Right now. She stood in the candlelight of her own dressing chamber, 23 years old, wearing a gown that cost more than a village earns in a decade. Her hair had been braided by 12 handmaidens. Her skin had been oiled with amber and rose. Her lips had been painted the precise shade of a bleeding wound. She was, by every definition the world could offer, breathtaking. She was also absolutely terrified. Because in 47 minutes, those bells would summon her to the grand cathedral. And the man waiting at the end of that aisle? He had buried 2 wives already. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I did next. I looked at the girl behind me in the mirror, not my reflection, but her. A servant. A maid. A woman whose name the court had never once bothered to learn. She was holding a cleaning rag in her left hand and looking at me with eyes that already knew what I was about to ask her. I slipped the royal signet ring from my finger. I held it out. And the world, as both of us knew it, ended. Act 1, the silent swap. Let me take you back. Not hours, years. Because you cannot understand what happened in that dressing chamber unless you understand what kind of man was waiting at that altar. And to understand him, you have to understand what a kingdom looks like when it has been ruled by fear for so long that the fear itself becomes invisible. Becomes normal. King Aldric of Varenthia. 41 years old. Broad-shouldered. Handsome if you didn't look too closely at his eyes. And that was the thing about Aldric. Most people made the mistake of not looking closely enough. They saw the jaw, the crown, the ceremonial armor polished to a mirror shine. They saw a king. They didn't see the way his fingers curled when a servant moved too slowly. They didn't see what happened in the East Wing after midnight when the candles were extinguished and the screaming was swallowed by stone walls 3 feet thick. His first wife, Queen Mira, had died of a sudden illness 14 months into their marriage. The royal physicians had written it down as a fever. The palace maids who washed her linens knew better. They had seen the bruises. They had counted them. His second wife, a young duchess named Alara, had lasted 8 months. She'd reportedly thrown herself from the tower balcony overlooking the northern gardens. The court had mourned with great ceremony. The king had worn black for exactly 3 weeks. On the 22nd day, he'd sent his first envoy to the court of King Brennan of Crestfall. He wanted a third wife. He wanted me. My father, King Brennan, was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly, because what he did was not cruelty. It was something almost worse. It was pragmatism. Varenthia controlled the only mountain pass through which Crestfall's trade routes flowed. Aldric had made it very simple, his bride, or his blockade. Within 2 years, my kingdom would starve. My father sat across from me at the long dinner table, and he didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the candle between us. He said, "You're a Princess Sera. Sacrifice is written into the blood of royalty." I said nothing. I went back to my chambers. I did not sleep. Her name was Mira. The maid. I need you to understand something about Mira before I tell you what happened between us in that dressing room, because the world will try to make her invisible, and she was anything but. Mira had been in the palace since she was 11 years old. She was now 22. She had dark hair she kept pinned tightly beneath her cap, and hands that were rough from lye soap, and a way of moving through a room that made her seem like part of the furniture, there, but unseen. Deliberately unseen, because Mira was clever, and she had long ago learned that visibility in a palace like this was not an asset. It was a liability. She had been assigned to my personal chambers 3 years prior. In all that time, she had spoken to me perhaps 200 words in total. But she had listened. Oh, she had listened to everything. She was the one who had told me, quietly, without looking up from sweeping the hearth, that Queen Alara had not thrown herself from that balcony. She'd said it in 9 words. The stones were wrong. Her slippers were facing inward. She'd meant someone had carried her there. She'd meant, run. 47 minutes before the bells. I was sitting at my vanity, and my 12 handmaidens had been dismissed. I had insisted, which was unusual enough that 2 of them had glanced at each other with uncertain eyes before filing out. Only Mira remained, because Mira was not technically a handmaiden. She was staff. Cleaning staff. She had no reason to leave. Or perhaps she knew I would ask her to stay. I looked at her in the mirror. She looked back at me. And I held up the signet ring. In the silence of that room, with the distant bells just beginning their preliminary toll, one ring, low and sonorous, the first warning that the ceremony was approaching, I said the words I had spent 3 sleepless nights rehearsing. I need 40 minutes. Maybe less. I need someone wearing this veil when they open that door. Mira set down her cleaning rag. She turned to face me fully, the first time she had ever done that. Completely. Without the sideways angle of deference. "And what do I do," she said, "when he lifts it?" I could feel my heart in my throat. Pray he doesn't. A long beat. 2 heartbeats. 3. And if he does? I swallowed. Run. She crossed the room. She took the signet ring from my open palm. Her fingers were warm against mine, calloused, steady, the hands of someone who had survived things I had only been sheltered from. She slipped it onto her finger. She looked down at it. Then she looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw something I have never forgotten. Not in all the years that followed, I saw the absolute, crystalline absence of fear. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already decided. "Go," she said. And I went. But before I tell you how I escaped, before I tell you what waited for me in the servants' tunnels, and what Mira faced when that veil was lifted, I need you to understand one thing. There was a man. Not the king. Not my father. Someone else entirely. Someone I never should have noticed. Someone the palace walls were never supposed to let me see. And whether I wanted it or not, whether it was reckless, dangerous, and entirely, catastrophically foolish, he was already tangled into everything that happened next. His name was Kale. I had first seen Kale 6 weeks before the wedding. He was a stonemason. A contract worker brought in to repair the crumbling eastern wall of the palace gardens, one of those invisible workers who exists in a royal household the way shadows exist. Necessary. Unacknowledged. I had been walking the garden path at dawn, the only hour when the grounds belonged entirely to me, when I'd rounded the hedgerow and found him there. Sitting on the fallen stones, eating bread from a cloth wrap, watching the sunrise as though it owed him something. He'd looked up at me without startling. Most people startled. He'd just looked. Dark eyes. A jaw rough with several days of neglect. A scar along his left forearm that caught the early light. He was perhaps 28. 29. He had the particular stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time outdoors in silence. He did not bow. He did not scramble to his feet. He looked at me the way a man looks at something genuinely interesting and said, "You're up early for a princess." I had stopped walking. Stared at him. Said, with more surprise than I intended, "You know who I am?" "Everyone knows who you are," he'd said, with the particular flatness of someone stating an obvious fact. "Doesn't mean I have to pretend you're made of glass." No one had spoken to me like that in my entire life. Not one person. I should have walked away. I should have reported him to the groundskeeper. I should have done approximately 17 things that I did not do. Instead, I sat down on the fallen stones beside him. And we talked until the palace woke up. 6 weeks later. 43 minutes to the bells. I shoved the memory of those mornings, all 6 of them, 6 stolen hours I had constructed elaborate pretexts to justify, into a locked room in the back of my mind, and I moved. I had spent 3 nights memorizing the servants' tunnels from a map Mira had scratched into the dirt floor of the hearth room and then swept away again. The palace of Varenthia was old, older than the current dynasty, and it was riddled with the bones of former lives. Passages built for grain storage. Maintenance corridors. A half-collapsed service route that ran beneath the grand cathedral itself and emerged, if the map was correct, behind the laundry house near the eastern gate. I wore Mira's uniform. The dress was rough wool against my skin, scratchy and slightly damp, smelling of lye and ash and something underneath that was just human, just lived in, and I was struck, powerfully and immediately, by the violence of the contrast. My silk had been chosen to slide. This fabric resisted everything, pulled at my elbows, bunched at my waist. This was a dress made for work. I rubbed soot from the cold hearth across my cheekbones, my forehead, the backs of my hands. Mira had showed me how enough to read as dirty in torchlight, not enough to smear and reveal pale, clean skin underneath. I tied my hair flat and low. I picked up a bucket, and I stepped into the passage. The first thing you notice in the servants' tunnels is the dark. Not the soft, romantic dark of an unlit bedroom, actual dark. The kind that has weight. The kind that presses against your open eyes and makes your brain invent shapes in the nothing. I had a single tallow stub, barely the length of my thumb, shielded with my cupped palm. I walked 39 minutes to the bells. I took the first left, past the grain storage alcove. Counted 20 paces. Took the passage that bent right toward the old undercroft. The air changed as I went deeper, colder, damper, smelling of old stone and the faint ghost of kitchen grease from overhead pipes. I heard footsteps above me. I stopped, pressed myself against the wall. The footsteps passed, 2 sets, heavy, deliberate. Guards on patrol rotation. I had memorized their schedule too. I had 6 minutes before the next sweep of the corridor that crossed above the tunnel junction ahead. 6 minutes. I moved faster. Act 2. The decoy at the altar. While I moved through the dark beneath the palace, Mira was walking into the light. She had been dressed by the 2 remaining handmaidens who had returned when I did not reappear. I had slipped out while they were fetching the final veil, and by the time they came back to the dressing chamber, they found Mira standing at the vanity in my gown. The veil already lowered, the signet ring on her finger. They had hesitated. Both of them. And then the senior handmaiden, a woman named Doss who had been dressing royal women for 30 years and had survived by understanding exactly when not to ask questions, had straightened Mira's veil and said, simply, "The cathedral is waiting, Your Highness." I want you to think about what Mira was doing right now. I want you to really feel it. She was not a trained actress. She was not a warrior. She was a maid from a village outside the palace walls who had been brought here at 11 years old and who had spent 11 years perfecting the art of being overlooked. And now she was walking down the longest aisle in the kingdom, in front of 500 court witnesses, toward a king who had killed before. Her hands, hidden beneath the silk gloves that were part of the bridal ensemble, her hands were shaking. She told me this later. She said they had not stopped shaking from the moment she stepped out of the dressing chamber. But she had clasped them together in front of her, the way she had seen noble women clasp their hands, and she had focused on one thing. One thing. Each step. Just this step. Then the next. Don't think about the face at the end of the aisle. Don't think about the veil lifting. Don't think about what comes after. This step. This stone. This breath. King Aldric stood at the altar in his full ceremonial regalia, gold-trimmed deep crimson, the crown of Varenthia on his brow, 2 rubies set into it that caught the cathedral light and threw it back in drops of red. He was an imposing figure. Even the priests on either side of him seemed slightly reduced by proximity. He watched the figure in white approach him. His expression, witnesses later reported, was one of satisfaction. The satisfaction of a collector who has finally acquired the piece he's been hunting. Something owned. Something controlled. He had waited 3 months for this bride. Had negotiated ruthlessly for her. Had issued the trade ultimatum that brought her kingdom to heel. He believed she was his. Mira reached the altar. She stood with her face beneath the veil, her hands clasped, her breathing so carefully controlled that it was the only thing she was doing with any conscious intention. Breathe. Hold. Release. Breathe. The bishop began the ceremony. The ancient words of binding, Words that had been spoken in this cathedral for 400 years rolled through the vaulted stone above them. The guests in their finest silks sat in rows, watching with the politely interested faces of people attending a necessary social event. Some were genuinely curious. Some were calculating political angles. A few, the very few who had been at Alara's wedding, were quietly, privately, praying. Aldric did not look at the bishop. He watched the veil. He had a particular stillness that his court had learned to fear. When Aldric was satisfied, he was animated, spoke loudly, gestured expansively, laughed with his whole chest. When Aldric was watching, waiting, assessing, he went still. Perfectly, dangerously still. He was still now, watching the veil. Mira could feel his attention through the fabric. She told me later that it was like standing in front of an open furnace, not quite burning, but the heat pressing into your face, your throat, your hands, and the knowledge that between you and that heat was only the thinnest possible barrier. The ceremony progressed. Vows were spoken by the bishop on behalf of the bride. As was tradition when the bride came from a foreign court, she was required only to speak the single word of binding at the ceremony's end. Mira had practiced the word. She had whispered it to herself in the dark of the dressing chamber while she waited for the handmaidens to arrive. One word. She could do one word. But here is the thing about Aldric that made Mira's plan, my plan, exponentially more dangerous than it appeared. He broke with tradition. Midway through the ceremony, he raised one hand. The bishop stopped speaking. The entire cathedral held its breath. Aldric reached up, slowly, deliberately, with the ease of a man who has never once in his life been told no, and took the edge of Mira's veil between two fingers. "I prefer," he said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that ancient stone room, "to see my bride's face while she hears her vows." The bishop looked uncertain. This was not protocol. Protocol existed precisely to prevent moments like this, unpredictable, uncontrolled moments where the choreography of power broke down and revealed the raw mechanics underneath. But no one in that cathedral was going to tell Aldric no. No one. The veil lifted. Mira's face. Not the princess of Crestfall. A young woman with dark eyes and calloused hands, and a face that had spent 11 years learning to show nothing. She showed nothing now. The court saw the king's face change. It did not explode into rage. That would come later. What they saw first was something almost more frightening, a slow, cold comprehension. Like watching a fire go out and leave only ash. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And she said, quietly, without trembling, with a steadiness, "I still cannot fully account for your majesty." "Where," said Aldric, "is my bride?" And then we are back in the tunnels, and I am running. Act 3. Through the Golden Trap. I heard the bells change. I was 40 feet below the eastern garden, navigating the last bend in the servants' passage, my tallow stub nearly gone. I was cupping the last finger of flame with both palms, when the wedding bells, which had been rolling in slow ceremonial sequence, shifted. The rhythm broke. For rapid strikes. A pause. For more. An alarm pattern. I didn't know that specifically, I hadn't known to look for it, but something in my body recognized it before my mind did. Something ancient. Something animal. He knows. I ran. The passage bucked upward. I had been warned about this on Mira's dirt map, the long incline toward the drainage junction, and my bucket clanged against the stone wall once, twice. Too loud. Far too loud. I nearly dropped it. Caught it. Pressed on. The tallow stub guttered and died. Absolute darkness. I stopped. Hand against the stone wall, rough, cold, damp. Breathe. Which direction? The map was in my memory. The tunnel went straight for 12 more paces, then there was a low arch. I would need to duck, and beyond the arch, a 30-foot straight run to the drainage grate. The drainage grate opened behind the laundry house. The laundry house was staffed at all hours. 15 feet past the laundry house was the eastern service gate. The eastern service gate opened into the market road. 12 paces. Duck. 30 feet. Grate. 15 feet. Gate. I moved. In the dark. One hand trailing the wall. The other arm extended into the nothing ahead of me. I counted. 8, 9, 10, 11. I ducked. My forehead still caught the top of the arch, stone against skull, a burst of white behind my eyes, the metallic taste of bitten tongue. I kept moving. Ahead of me, dim. Gray. The faintest suggestion of shape. Light. The drainage grate. It was a heavy iron grate, rusted at 2 of its 4 hinges, and it opened outward, away from me. I knew from Mira that it had not been opened in at least 2 years. She had discovered it by accident, she'd told me, during a drain-clearing job when she was 17, and had kept the knowledge as carefully as a coin kept against desperate times. Desperate times. I put both hands flat against the grate and pushed. It resisted. I pushed harder. The rust screamed. I felt the sound more than heard it, metal protesting metal, and then the grate gave, swinging outward with a groan that seemed, in my particular state of terror, loud enough to wake the dead. I tumbled out. And then air. Real air. Open sky. The smell of laundry soap and horse and city and rain. I sat on my hands and knees in the mud behind the laundry house, and I breathed it in, and for exactly 4 seconds, not a moment more, I allowed myself to feel it. Outside. Then I got up, adjusted my maid's cap, picked up my bucket, and walked. Here is something no one tells you about escape. The hardest part is not the running. The hardest part is the walking. Walking slowly when every nerve in your body is screaming to sprint. Walking with the practiced slouch of someone who belongs in a servant's uniform, who has been wearing this uniform her whole life, who has absolutely no reason to be moving with urgency toward the Eastern Service gate. I walked past 2 kitchen maids carrying linen. They didn't look at me. I was invisible. Mira had been right about that. The uniform was its own invisibility. The soot on my face was its own disguise. I walked past a stable hand loading hay. I walked past a pair of off-duty guards playing dice on a barrel, their backs to me, laughing at something between them. Each step. Just this step. Then the next. The Eastern Service gate was open. Of course it was open. It was a service gate. Goods flowed through it all morning, and there was a single gate attendant, an older man with a ledger, checking the carts of market vendors making morning deliveries. He did not have a list of faces to check against. Not yet. I walked through. The market road opened up ahead of me, wider and louder and more chaotic and more alive than anything I had experienced in my entire palace-bound life, and I walked into it. And I kept walking. I had exactly 2 things in my possession. A maid's uniform. And a name, an address, scratched onto a scrap of paper that Mira had pressed into my palm 3 nights before our arrangement, before we had ever fully spoken it aloud, as though she had known this moment was coming long before I did. Find the woman called Bren, she'd said, in the Tinker's Row of the lower city. Tell her the white gate opens inward. She'll know. I had asked her, who is Bren? Mira had looked at me steadily. Someone who's helped people disappear before, she'd said. Someone who owes me a debt. There was a great deal, I was beginning to understand, that Mira knew. And there was something else. Someone else. Because as I stepped off the market road and into the narrower lane that led toward the lower city, moving fast now, head down, bucket in hand, a hand closed around my wrist. I nearly screamed. Easy. I spun. Kale. The stonemason. Standing in the shadow of a canvas awning, dressed in his work clothes, mortar dust on his forearms, looking at me with those dark eyes that had never once treated me like something made of glass. My heart did something complicated and inconvenient. What are you? I started. Mira told me, he said quietly. 3 days ago. She told me to be here. I stared at him. She told you. She said you'd argue about it. A pause, and the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile. She wasn't wrong. I looked at the hand still loosely encircling my wrist. He followed my gaze. Released me, immediately, without making it awkward, which somehow made it more so. I know where Bren's house is, he said. And I know the back ways to get there without crossing the main road. From the direction of the palace, a new sound had begun. Horns. Multiple horns. Deep and directional search horns. The kind used for perimeter sweeps. My decision window was approximately 30 seconds. I looked at Kale. He looked back at me. Well, he said. We moved. Act 4. The Discovery of the Deception. Let me tell you what happened when Aldric lifted that veil. Because I was not there to see it. But Mira was. And she told me everything later when we were both somewhere the king's voice couldn't reach us. When Mira said, "Your Majesty," in that cathedral, Aldric did not immediately react. That was the most frightening thing, the stillness. The 5 full seconds of absolute nothing on his face while he looked at her and understood that he had been made a fool of. In front of 500 witnesses. At his own altar. In his own kingdom. The court held its breath. The bishop took an unconscious step backward. Aldric reached out and took Mira's face between his thumb and forefinger, not violently, not yet, but with a precision that was its own kind of violence, and turned her face slowly, left and right, examining her. As though she were a forgery, he was analyzing for the flaw that had fooled him. Then he released her. He turned to the Lord Commander of his royal guard, a man called Tyrant, who stood at attention in the cathedral's side archway. "Lock the gates," said Aldric. His voice was very quiet. "All of them. Every gate. Seal the palace." Theron moved without a word. "Find her," said Aldric. "She has not had long. She cannot be far." He turned back to look at Mira. She stood perfectly still. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, Mira was certain she was going to die right there, in the cathedral, in front of everyone. Instead, Aldric straightened. He smoothed the front of his ceremonial tunic. He turned to the assembly of stunned, silent court witnesses. "There will be a reception," he said, in a voice that invited absolutely no discussion, "this evening. As planned." He walked off the altar. He walked through the cathedral's private entrance. And the moment the door closed behind him, the room erupted. Mira stood at the altar alone. And then she ran. She did not run toward the cathedral entrance. She ran toward the vestry, behind the altar, through the priest's preparation room, out the narrow side door that opened onto the cathedral's herb garden. She knew the geography because she had cleaned this building for 3 years. She knew the herb garden connected to the bishop's private courtyard. She knew the bishop's private courtyard had a back gate onto the cloister walk. She knew the cloister walk connected, at its far end, to the hospital wing, which had a service entrance, which had a laundry cart that came and went throughout the day. She had not planned this in advance. She was improvising. And she was brilliant at it. We heard the horns just as we turned off the market road. Kale moved differently the moment the sound changed, a subtle shift, like a gear engaging, and I noticed it. He moved faster without appearing to hurry. He took corners with the ease of someone who has navigated this city his whole life, which of course he had. He knew which alleys ran straight through and which curved back. He knew which doorways were deep enough to step into and which were occupied. He also, I noticed, walked slightly behind me and to my left. Not leading. Flanking. "You don't have to protect me," I said, without looking at him. "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Force of habit." We walked in silence for a moment. The sounds of the city were strange to me, the real city, not the formal procession views I'd had from carriage windows. It was louder than I expected. It smelled sharper. It had textures, the unevenness of the cobblestones under my feet, the way the buildings pressed close and the sky narrowed above, the heat from a bread oven spilling through an open window, the cold air sliding off the river at the end of the lane. It was, despite everything, extraordinary. "You're looking at everything," Kale said. "I've never actually seen any of it," I said. A pause. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you have." There was nothing pitying in it. Just observation. The same way he'd said, "You're up early for a princess," stated like fact, like something noticed without judgment. I found I could breathe slightly easier with him beside me. This was not the time to examine why. The horns again, closer now. Here, said Kale. He stopped in front of a narrow door set flush into a stone wall. If you didn't know it was there, you would walk right past it. He knocked twice, paused, knocked once. A slide of a bar. The door opened. A woman's face, sharp eyes, 60 years old, the kind of face that has seen a very great deal and remains exactly as impressed as it chooses to be. White gate opens inward, I said. The woman, Bren, looked at me. Then at Kale. He's with you. Yes, I said. She said, which communicated a great deal without specifying any of it. And she stepped back and let us in. Inside Bren's house, sitting at a table with a cup of tea and dried blood on her temple where the cathedral stone had caught her when she'd stumbled in the vestry doorway, was Mira. I stopped in the doorway. She looked at me. And then, in the 11 years I had known her, across the 11 years of careful, professional, deliberate silence between us, she did something I had never once seen her do. She laughed. Not long. Not loud. A short, helpless burst of it, the laugh of someone who has survived something absurd and cannot quite believe it. I sat down across from her. I looked at her bloodied temple. At the ripped hem of my wedding gown she was still wearing, trailing across Bren's stone floor. At the signet ring still on her finger. She slid it off and set it on the table between us. He didn't kill you, I said. Not yet, she said. A pause. He will, she said. Not with despair, with flat practicality. When he finds me. He won't, I said. She looked at me with the polite skepticism of someone who has been the underestimated party her whole life and has a very good statistical basis for it. I have resources, I said. She looked at Kale. Kale nodded slightly. Bren set cups of tea in front of all of us, which was somehow the most grounding thing that had happened in hours. Back in his private war room, a room most of his court had never entered and did not know the full contents of, Aldric was standing at a table covered in maps. He was not shouting. This was the detail his inner circle most feared. When Aldric shouted, you knew where you stood. The storm had direction. You could navigate around it. When Aldric was quiet and methodical, things happened to people. She has been gone, he said, at minimum 40 minutes before the discovery. Likely 55. He pressed 2 fingers to a point on the city map. The eastern gate was the only gate not on rotation at that window. She used the eastern gate. Theron, the Lord Commander, stood across the table from him. We have men on all roads now, Your Majesty. The roads, said Aldric, are not where she is. He stood back from the table. She had help. She planned this. She is not on any road. He paused. She is in the lower city. He looked at Theron. Tear it apart if you have to. Outside, through a gap in Bren's shuttered window, the first soldiers had begun to move through the market road. Methodical. Systematic. Like water filling a room. Act 5. The price of a new life. 3 days. That is how long we stayed in Bren's house while the king's men systematically searched the lower city. Bren's house was built on 3 levels, and it had a basement that did not appear on any city record because it had been constructed 60 years prior by a man who had very specific reasons to want an unregistered basement. It was dry, which was the most you could say for it. There was a lantern. There were cots. There were stores of dried food that Bren replenished with the casual confidence of someone who had done this before. She had done this before. Mira had known Bren since she was 16, as it turned out. And Bren was, I had no other word for it, an underground architect. A woman who had spent 40 years quietly, systematically building a network of safe houses, false identities, tunnel routes, and contact points that allowed people in desperate situations to become invisible. How many people have you helped? I asked her on the 2nd day. Bren looked at me over her tea. Enough, she said. People like me? No. She set the cup down. People like your maid. I thought about that for a long time. People like Mira, people without power, without resources, without the protection of a name or a bloodline, had apparently needed Bren far more often and far more urgently than people like me. I had thought of myself, these past several days, as someone escaping oppression. And I was. Aldric was a monster and my situation was genuinely dangerous. But I had also had the education to study the tunnel maps, the mental space to plan, the years of palace access that gave me the knowledge to navigate it. I had had Mira, who had protected me, guided me, bled for me before she protected herself. I sat with this. It was not comfortable. On the morning of the second day, in the low amber light of the basement lantern, Mira was asleep on one of the cots, and I was sitting with my back against the stone wall, and Kale was sitting across from me, sharpening a small knife with a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, grounding. "You're thinking very loudly," he said, without looking up. "Sorry," I said. "Don't be." A pause. "What is it?" I looked at him. The angle of the lantern threw half of his face into shadow and left the other half in warm light, the scar on his forearm, the careful attention in his hands, the particular stillness I had first noticed in the garden at dawn. "What am I now?" I said. He looked up. "What do you mean?" I stopped. Tried again. "I was a princess because I was born into it. That's finished. I have no court, no title, no resources, no kingdom that will claim me now that claiming me means provoking Aldric. I'm wearing a servant's dress." I paused. "So what am I?" Kale set down the knife. He looked at me for a long moment, and this was the thing about how he looked at me, the thing that had pulled me back to that garden 6 mornings running, the thing I was spending considerable effort not examining too closely. He looked at me like I was a specific, particular, singular person. Not a title. Not a strategic asset. Not a prize. Just a person. "You're the woman who chose," he said finally. "Most people in a gilded cage convince themselves it's a home. You didn't." "That doesn't answer the question," I said. "No," he said. "But it's the only part that matters." A beat. Something was happening in the air between them that was slow and deliberate and entirely, carefully, not acted upon, not here, not now, not while the world above them was in crisis. But it was there. Both of them knew it was there. And neither of them named it. The knife went back to the whetstone. I looked at the ceiling. On the third morning, Bren came downstairs with a look on her face that cut the room's temperature by several degrees. "The soldiers are changing their pattern," she said. "They've stopped searching door to door. They're watching instead." We looked at her. "That's worse," Mira said. "Yes," said Bren. "It means they think their target is still in the city. It means they're waiting." She set a piece of paper on the table between us. "There is a wagon leaving for the Southern Merchant Road at dawn tomorrow. The driver is part of the network. He's moved cargo for me before. By cargo, I mean people." She looked at me, then at Mira, then briefly at Kale. "It goes as far as the border town of Kelrath. From Kelrath, there are passes through the Aren Mountains." "And beyond the mountains?" I said. "Beyond the mountains," she said, "is not Aldric's kingdom." But there was something in her pause before she'd finished that sentence. "What is it?" said Mira. Bren looked at her. "There's a complication." She sat down at the table. "I've received word, through the network, from inside the palace. From one of my contacts in the household staff." She folded her hands. "Aldric has announced that the servant who impersonated the princess at the ceremony will be publicly executed when found. By royal edict. No trial." The room went silent. Mira's face showed nothing. Absolutely nothing. She had the most extraordinary face I had ever seen for showing nothing. "He's using it," Bren continued, "as a statement. If he cannot punish the princess, he will punish the accomplice. Publicly. As a message." "A message to whom?" I said. "To anyone who might be thinking about helping you," said Bren. I looked at Mira. I said, "You knew this was a possibility." She looked back at me. "Yes. When we made the arrangement, you knew that if it worked, if I got out, he would come for you." "Yes." "Why did you agree?" Mira looked at her hands on the table. The hands that had held a cleaning rag in a royal dressing chamber 3 days ago while the world changed. Because, she said, I had watched 2 women die in that palace. And I was not willing to watch a third. The plan, as it stood, was this. The wagon at dawn would carry all 3 of us, myself, Mira, and Kale, who had stated simply that he was coming and had produced 0 additional explanation and 0 interest in discussion, beneath a false floor fitted for exactly this purpose. It would pass through the southern checkpoint on the strength of the driver's established papers and the very ordinary appearance of a merchant's delivery run. From the checkpoint to Kelrath, 4 days on the road. From Kelrath to the mountain passes, 1 more day. From the mountain passes to the border territory of Answal, which maintained careful, deliberate political neutrality and had absolutely no interest in antagonizing either Varenthia or any refugee population sheltering within its borders. Freedom. And the network there? I said. In Answal. Bren nodded. They'll find you work. A place to settle. New names. New names. I turned this over. A new name. 23 years I had been Sera, Princess of Crustfall. Everything I had ever owned, thought, felt, been accused of, been desired for, been threatened over, all of it attached to that name, to that title, to the blood that ran in my veins and that I could not choose or change or set down. And now someone was offering me a new one. What do most people choose? I asked. Bren smiled for the first time. Small. Dry. But genuine. Something ordinary, she said. Something that doesn't stand out. Something that sounds like it belongs to someone who has always just been here. I looked at Mira. What's your name going to be? I said. She considered it with the same seriousness she applied to everything. Bren already picked one for me, she said, and glanced at the older woman. Lena, said Bren. Mira, Lena, turned the name over silently. Then nodded once. Like accepting a well-made thing. I looked at Kale. And you? He looked faintly amused. Kale is ordinary enough. It's not a palace name, I said. No, he said. It's not. I turned to Bren. Call me Ren, I said. And Bren wrote it down. Laid in the basement. Mira asleep. Bren upstairs, watching the street through her shutter gap. The lantern very low. Just Kale and Sera, Ren, and the quiet. He was leaning against the wall opposite, legs extended, arms crossed. Eyes open, watching her with the unhurried attention that she had come to understand was simply how he was. It wasn't performance, wasn't strategy, it was just him, a person who looked at things fully and without apology. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about King Brennan, sitting at the long dinner table, looking at the candle because he could not look at her. Sacrifice is written into the blood of royalty. She was thinking about whether she would ever be able to send word. Whether she would ever be able to explain. Whether he would understand that she had not run from him, but from what he had been asked to trade her for. Whether it mattered if he understood. You're thinking loudly again, Kale said. My father, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Is he a good man? She thought about it carefully, not a reflex answer, but genuinely thought about it. He is not a bad man, she said, finally. But I don't think that was enough. Kale nodded slowly. The kind of nod that means, I hear that. And it's complicated. And you don't need me to make it simpler than it is. You could go back, he said. Carefully. Not pushing, offering. Not now. But eventually. When things change. Kingdoms change. Aldric won't change. No. But kings die. The word hung in the air not as threat, but as the plain, eventual reality of time. Is that what you'd want, he said? To go back? If you could. She looked at the ceiling of the basement. The cold stone. The lantern's small circle of light. She thought about the garden at dawn. She thought about 6 mornings on fallen stones. She thought about bread from a cloth wrap and a man who had looked at her like she was just a person, just an interesting person, and had not bowed. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ask me when I've had more than 3 days to exist outside a palace. The ghost of a smile. Fair. A long pause. The warmth between them was quiet and real, and neither of them reached for it, not now, not in this basement with the soldiers above and the border still ahead. But the possibility of it was there, patient as a door not yet opened. "Cale," she said. Why are you actually here?" He looked at her. "What Mira said wasn't enough," she said. "You could have just gone back to your stonework. You don't know me. You have no obligation to." "6 mornings," he said simply. She stopped. "I know," he said. "That's not enough, by any reasonable standard. It's 6 conversations. It's 6 dawns." But he paused, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was uncertain, not quite sure of itself, younger than his usual stillness. "You talked to me like you were interested in what I thought. Not what I could build or carry or move. Not as scenery." He looked at his hands. "Most people don't do that. With anyone. And you'd never done it, presumably, with someone like me." "No," she said softly. "I hadn't." "So." He looked up. 6 mornings seemed like enough to know I wanted to see what happened next. She looked at Cale. Cale looked back. And neither of them said the rest of it. There was time for the rest of it. There was going to be time. Before the dawn. While Mira slept and Bren kept watch. "I need to tell you the last piece. The piece that stayed with me longer than any other part of these 3 days." I crept upstairs, past Bren at her window, and I asked her for a piece of paper and a pen. She gave them to me without a word. I wrote 2 letters. The first was to my father. I told him I was alive. I told him I could not tell him where. I told him that I was sorry for the trade route and the political consequence and the fear he must be feeling, and I told him that I forgave him for the table and the candle and the words he had chosen. And I told him that I hoped, when the cost of this had settled, that he would understand, even if he couldn't say so, that what I had done was not a failure of royal duty. It was the only royal thing I had ever truly chosen. I folded that letter and left it with Bren to send through the network. Eventually, when it was safe, the second letter was shorter. It was to Aldric. I will not tell you everything I wrote, but the last line I will tell you. Because I wrote it for the version of myself that had sat in that dressing chamber in silence for 23 years, and I want her to have it said. I wrote, "I was never your prize. I was never anyone's prize. And I walked out of your palace wearing soot on my face and a servant's dress, and I was the freest I have ever been in my life, and you will spend the rest of your reign knowing that the woman you chose to cage was clever enough to pick the lock." I blew the ink dry. I folded it. I gave it to Bren. "Make sure he gets that one," I said. She looked at me. A long beat. "Oh," she said, with real satisfaction, "absolutely." Epilogue. Ren. The wagon left before sunrise. 3 people beneath a false floor, breathing carefully, not speaking, listening to the sound of hooves on cobblestone, and then, slowly, gradually, the sounds of the city thinning. The calls of early vendors fading. The checkpoint voices, briefly, tense, and then the guard's satisfied grunt and the wave-through and the sound of cobblestone giving way to packed dirt road. And then open country. And then silence. And then, through a gap in the wagon's sideboards, a sliver of sky, going from deep blue to the first pale suggestion of gold. Dawn. Somewhere behind us, in a palace of crimson and gold, a king with 2 dead wives and a kingdom held by fear was reading a letter from a woman who had walked out of his trap wearing soot on her face. Somewhere behind us, 500 court witnesses were gossiping furiously about the most extraordinary wedding they had ever attended. Somewhere behind us, my father was sitting at a long table with a candle he could finally look at. And ahead of us, the mountains. The border. The territory that was not Aldric's. A woman named Rin, who had once been a princess, lying flat beneath a wagon floor with calluses not yet earned but coming, with a new name that fit her like a dress chosen rather than assigned. And beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of, in the cold of the wagon's shadow, a stonemason who had never once treated her like glass. "What does Answell look like?" she asked, in a whisper. She felt rather than saw him consider the question. Green, he said finally. Hills. A river, I think, through the main valley. Markets on Tuesdays. Markets, she repeated. The word tasted like something brand new. I've never been to a market, she said. Not actually. Not on foot. Not as yourself, he said. Yes. A pause. Wren, he said, and she heard the shape of her new name in his voice for the first time, careful, deliberate, like setting something down where it belongs. Wren. I'll take you to every market in Answell. And in the sliver of sky visible through the wagon's sideboard, the dawn completed itself. Full in gold and belonging to no one. The close. There is a version of this story where Wren makes it to the border and the wagon rolls into the hills of Answell and the mountains seal off everything behind her like a closed book, and that is the end. And there is another version, where the king's trackers are more patient than she knew. Where the network Bren built has a crack in it she doesn't know about yet. Where the man beside her in the wagon has his own past she hasn't thought to ask about. Where the maid who saved a princess's life by standing at a monster's altar might one day decide that hiding was never going to be her permanent answer. Where a woman with soot on her face and a new name and a whole life yet to be written might someday turn back toward the palace she escaped. Not to return, but to make sure no one else has to run from it. That story is not finished being told. And if you felt what I was trying to make you feel tonight, if some part of you has been Wren, worn the wrong name, lived in someone else's cage, made the terrifying choice to walk out anyway, then you already know that the best stories don't end. They begin. If this story moved you, if some moment in it caught in your chest and held on, leave a comment below and tell me which moment it was. Was it Mira at the altar? Wren in the dark of the tunnel? The letter she left behind? I read every single one. And if you know someone who is standing in their own dressing chamber right now, holding their own signet ring, trying to decide, send them this. Because some stories are the thing people need to hear before they can make the choice they already know they need to make. And if you've been here with me for this whole ride, hit that like button. Not because an algorithm asked you to. Because Mira stood at a monster's altar in a stolen dress and bought us all 40 minutes. The least we can do is make sure her story gets found.